Welcome to another edition of Wine and Cheese. We are delighted at the New Civil Liberties Alliance to provide a platform for folks who have been deplatformed. We are here to uncork the canceled and provide a platform for folks to share their ideas with us, not to whine about what happened to them, but to share ideas that weren't welcome where they were before. And we're delighted to have with us today to talk about an incident that happened at Georgetown University Law School. Ilya Shapiro, who is the incoming senior fellow and director of constitutional studies at the Manhattan Institute. Welcome to the New Civil Liberties Alliance, Ilya. Welcome to Wine and Cheese.
Thanks, Mark. Cheers.
Cheers. Good to have you with us. So let me, rather than me summarize what happened to you, why don't you summarize the incident, and then I've got lots of questions for you, but we'll go from there.
Sure. Hopefully I've got this story down. I've been talking about it nonstop to the media the last 2 weeks. It's a lot more fun to drive the media cycle than have it driven into you. That's one thing I've learned. Yeah. So after nearly 15 years at Cato, where I was ultimately the vice president and director of constitutional studies,
and writer of multiple amicus briefs in NCLA cases.
That's right. That's right. And I think we've joined on briefs as well. So that's a great partnership that I hope will continue, in fact. Yeah. And I've known Mark for 20 years in various capacities as well. So and this isn't the first time we've had a glass of wine between us either. But anyway, coming back to my story, I was perhaps looking for new challenges after almost 15 years at Cato, and was presented with a new opportunity. It was very interesting to become the executive director of the Georgetown Center for the Constitution. Now, this is opposed to the rest of the law school, which is the Georgetown Center Against the Constitution. Randy Barnett, who should be no stranger to anyone watching this, was the faculty director and founder, and would be my boss. And this was announced to great fans.
He's on the board of the New Civil Liberties Alliance.
Wonderful. And so this was announced, including by the dean of Georgetown, Bill Traynor, to great excitement, because now he could crow to his alumni that he's for intellectual diversity. Out of the 150 members of the faculty, the non-progressives would now increase from 3.5 to 4.5. So that was great.
I'll ask you who the half is later, but go ahead.
But a few days later,
maybe it was you.
A few days later, he issued another statement condemning me, saying that the tweet that I'm about to describe was appalling and antithetical to the work that Georgetown does to have a welcoming and inclusive community. So a few days before I was due to formally join the Georgetown faculty, which was February 1st, so a few days before that, January 26th, news of Justice Breyer's retirement broke. I was actually in the air when it broke. I landed.
It was leaked, in fact.
That's right. It was leaked. It wasn't him. That's right. The White House sort of forced his hand. They're like, we're going to lock this in, this vacancy. So I landed in Austin, Texas, and my phone was blown up because I'm a Supreme Court expert. In fact, I wrote a book on the politics of judicial nominations, Supreme Disorder, Judicial Nominations in the Politics of America's Highest Court, coming out in paperback July 5th. So you can get the hardcover cheap now and then pre-order the paperback.
Just on your Supreme Court expert point, I've been on Fox News a couple of times. One time they put Supreme Court expert on the chyron. I have not heard the end of that from my sister. It's like, oh, it's Mr. Supreme Court expert. So,
yeah, well, there you go. I'll credit you, Mark. I mean, it's a low bar to be an expert on TV on anything. I remember my first or second week at Cato, 15 years ago, where I was quoted in the New York Times or somewhere for whatever. I'm like, oh, they quote people like me. I will no longer trust their analysis of some area that I have known nothing about. So I was doing media. I put out statements, blog posts about the vacancy, and just really was upset about Joe Biden reiterating his campaign pledge that he would appoint a black woman. Why? I have nothing against black women, but I do have something against limiting a candidate pool, whether you're talking about a receptionist or a lawyer or one of the highest public offices in the land, restricting that pool by immutable characteristics like race and sex. And so late that night, after I'd gotten back from a friend's celebratory dinner, I was feeling festive and feisty, and not a good practice. I was doom scrolling through Twitter before going to bed in my hotel room, and thought to express my discord, my concern with the president's HR practices. And so I thought to myself, well, I know who the plausible pool of candidates would be. And I thought, if I were a Democratic president, I would want Sri Srinivasan, the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit, also a Kansan.
A great Kansan, yes, like me and like Ilya's wife.
Right. So, but I was not thinking of my wife's provenance when I was thinking about this. He had been a shortlister, he'd been a finalist for the nomination that went to Merrick Garland at the end of the Obama years. But I said, he's very smart, very progressive, would be a great pick. Even has an identity politics benefit in that he's an Indian American, would be the first Asian or Indian American, as an immigrant as well. Great story. But alas, does not comport with the current intersectional hierarchy, I said, and so we'll be left with, by order of logic, if I think that he's the best and everybody else is worse or less qualified, we'll be left with, given what Biden said, a, quote, lesser black woman.
That was the phrase in your tweet that created
those
all of the consternation.
Those three words created the firestorm and national news, and bring us to why I'm on wine and cheese right now.
And I've known you for 20 years. I know you're not a racist. What did and I know that obviously a lot of people were quick to jump on this. Were you surprised that people were quick to jump on it, or when you sort of saw the tweet in the light of day the next day, did you think, could have said that better?
Well, in the light of day is exactly right. Right after I tweeted, I went to bed. And overnight was when the firestorm broke, and not by itself. I mean, there were instigators. My political or ideological enemies screen capped that and started distributing it and saying that they're shocked how racist and misogynist Shapiro is. When I saw it and I saw this was blowing up, I thought, I could have phrased that better. I gave it's unreasonable and in bad faith to interpret that as being racist and misogynist, but I gave my intellectual opponents, actually intellectual would be too strong, my ideological opponents, I opened the door for them to start attacking me and calling for my head. So I took it down. I said, sorry, didn't mean to offend, that was inartful. That's it. But
some people didn't want you to apologize at all.
That's
some
right.
People said,
that's right. I mean, the playbook, the standard playbook is never apologize. Now, each circumstance is different. I was playing both a public game and an inside game to try to keep my job. And I was dealing with things that I still can't fully go into about how to handle the faculty listserv and the Georgetown politics and the interests of Randy Center and all this. But, I had a limited apology. It wasn't just like, prostrate myself and say, oh no, make a sacrifice to the woke gods. I said, look, I phrased that poorly. I pride myself as being a communicator. I write and speak for a living. That was poor phrasing. It's distracting. People are now talking about, am I a racist or not, rather than the underlying point, with which 76% of Americans agreed that, Biden should have considered all possible candidates, at least according to that right-wing polling outfit, ABC News.
I'm not even sure he considered all black women. I never heard Janice Rogers Brown on the short list for the
This is the thing. People who were defending me, this was kind of drowned out. Like, I'm on record from 15 years ago saying I would have loved to see Janice Rogers Brown on the Supreme Court. But anyway, this exploded. And I tell you, that day, January 27th, the next day, was the second worst day of my life. I mean, it was god-awful. I thought I had blown up my entire life. I thought I'd killed my career, all the hard work, the sacrifices my parents made in taking me away from the Soviet Union, harmed my family. It was really bad. It was really bad. I right away started, thinking, who do I need to talk to? I'm in a fortunate position. I have friends who have political experience, who have public relations experience. I know people at FIRE, which is my new favorite organization, no offense to either you or my new employer, but the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression now, they've expanded the remit. It used to be the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education. Now it's an expression because they're going beyond educational institutions. But FIRE, whom I've known for a long time and worked with on amicus briefs or supporting their cases, I've been personal friends with folks, they helped me with crisis management and public relations and provided a lawyer for me throughout this whole ordeal. So they've been invaluable, as well as people. Again, I'm very fortunate to have people who have platforms both publicly and back channels to the dean and the what I've learned, one of the lessons from this, cancellation, if you're canceled, is figure out what your goal is. Mm-hmm. Is it to profit off this and monetize it? Is it to keep your job? Is it to, the physical safety can be an issue sometimes. What is your goal? So I set my goal of keeping this Georgetown job. So in the first,
and just to sort of dive down on that a little bit, you said physical safety. Did you receive threats on Twitter and otherwise?
Nothing different from the norm, I would say. Okay. People engaged in, reckless. There's various terms that in social media that are used for things. Nothing that made me afraid for my or my family's safety. I later got some emails that I directed to the Virginia Attorney General's office just in case something was going on. But during those initial few days, I thankfully did not feel that. Although there were physical manifestations of the cancellation campaign. I had trouble sleeping, stomach issues. I can't understate how terrible an experience this is for someone. So over the next few days, 4 days of hell, we preserved my job. That is, the dean decided that I would indeed be onboarded that February 1st, but immediately suspended with pay, pending investigation into whether my comments violated the university's harassment and anti-discrimination policy. So there started, after the 4 days of hell, 4 months of purgatory.
I was going to say, so fast forward 4 months, and we get the news. I heard it. I happened to be at a meeting in Nashville with Randy Barnett, and found out from him that they were going to let you keep your job. We were all excited to hear that. And you, in fact, you had 2 different pieces in the Wall Street Journal. The first one on June 2nd, my cancel culture nightmare is over, and you thought it was.
Yeah, hopefully at some point I can write something in the Wall Street Journal other than autobiography. At this point, my last 5 op-eds going back to my school board run.
President Obama's first 2 books were autobiographies. I don't know why you can't
right.
follow that trend.
But I accepted the technical victory. That is, the official ruling was, as the dean told me over a Zoom that around lunchtime on that Thursday, 2 weeks ago as we're recording this, was that it turns out after 4 months of painstaking, magnifying glass, microscopic examination of every character of that tweet, somebody finally looked at a calendar and realized I had not been an employee when I tweeted, so was not subject to these policies under which I was investigated.
That doesn't always stop institutions, by the way.
Sure. Well, it took them 4 months to come up with that excuse and whatnot, and they hired Wilmer Hale, your former firm, if I'm not mistaken.
My former firm.
Spent a lot of money on advising them, and mind you, I was interviewed by the inquisitors, by the Office of, with the Orwellian name of Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Affirmative Action back in February, after about 3 weeks.
Yeah, it's a sick joke that acronym is IDEA.
Right. But the longer this went, it became clear that this was just a farce. And they were waiting for the students to get off campus at the end of the semester so they could, quietly reinstate me. But when I took that technical victory and celebrated it in the Wall Street Journal. But the dean put out a statement condemning me again and basically saying it's a tough spot because we have these 2 values in tension: free speech and making people feel welcome and unharassed. So how do you deal with that? I just don't know, but heavily insinuating that had I been employed or shot across the bow of other faculty members, be careful what you say because that could be subject you to discipline. And then a few hours later, when the Diversicrats report hit my inbox and I started reading it, I didn't start reading it that night. I was kind of trying to catch my breath. But the next morning, with my lawyer, with Randy, with my wife, who's a better lawyer than all of us, digesting this thing, and we came to the conclusion that they were setting me up for a fall. They were basically saying that the next time I say something that offends someone or someone claims they're offended or discomforted and files a complaint, that would be creating a hostile educational environment and I'd be subject to discipline. So there'd be this sort of Damocles over my head. I realized I had to go. And so I spent that weekend doing what probably was the best bit of lawyering I've ever done, writing a 4-page resignation letter that detailed the illiberal actions that Georgetown was taking, not just in enforcing a heckler's veto on faculty or student speech at Georgetown, not just in penalizing me for the campaign of outrage that my political enemies engaged in on Twitter and elsewhere, but applying those kinds of standards unequally and I gave examples of much more outrageous or inflammatory tweets by other professors from the left that were not investigated at Georgetown that were not investigated or punished, nor should they have been. I mean, they should have been criticized as they were, and all that. And I'm fine to be criticized, that's fine. But they, and then finally, my favorite part of this piece, which made it into the Wall Street Journal op-ed, where I 4 days later announced that I was resigning, gave very realistic hypotheticals of how I could get into trouble under the university standard that they'd set out in this report. So, for example, we're about to get the end-of-term decisions from the Supreme Court. If I laud a decision that overturns Roe v. Wade or that preserves gun rights, or this fall when the court hears cases challenging racial preferences in education admissions, all of a sudden somebody feels that that's hostile to them, and they write me up. So away we go.
Well, there's sort of a perverse consequentialism here. It seems to me, rather than recognize that taking offense is a choice, schools are saying if anyone's offended, then the speech itself must be offensive. And that just seems like it's bringing back the heckler's veto to me.
It goes against not just the spirit, but the explicit letter of Georgetown's very well-written free speech and expression policy, which is only 5 years old. Ratified by the faculty senate, and Dean Traynor and the president, laud it and it's really good. But as I write in my letter, it's a pixel barrier. Because they've implicitly, with this report to me...
As opposed to a parchment barrier.
Exactly, exactly. We have to update things for the times.
All right, very good.
They've implicitly repealed that excellent policy, which is, Georgetown's not alone in having good policies. Finally, FIRE and others have finally forced many institutions to draw up these policies to defend speech and expression.
And some have taken after... So University of Chicago is where you and I went to law school.
And, the gold standard.
And put together... several years ago now, but put together quite the First Amendment defense of free speech on campus, and a lot of universities have adopted the Chicago principles.
Yeah. So the problem is much more these days the application or the non-application or the subversion of the speech policy rather than having a speech code or not having a free speech protection policy.
Sure. Well, and the devil is in the details and sometimes in the application, because Chicago isn't perfect in the application either, as you know. Well, one question I have, Ilya, can intellectuals like you be hired at places like Georgetown today?
Well, we have that answer, and that's no. It begs the question of what's intellectuals like me means, what places like Georgetown means. The problem is not the age-old lament of left-wing faculty, right? It's for decades. It's been a truism that colleges, law schools, universities, skew to the left, as compared to society in absolute terms, however you measure it. But that's not what's going on here. I mean, I graduated college 25 years ago. I graduated law school almost 20 years ago. I don't think the ratio of liberal to moderate to conservative professors or students has really shifted all that much. So that's not what's going on. The problem is the Overton window of permissible policy expression or cultural expression or your views has shifted to the left and narrowed.
To the point where law firms won't even submit amicus briefs on one side of a lot of contentious issues today. Eugene Scalia gave a speech to the Federalist Society a couple of years ago, pointing out that if you look at the most recent sort of super contentious cases where there had been dozens and dozens of amicus briefs filed, you couldn't find a major law firm on one side of the issue, and yet there were 20, 30 law firms on the other side of the issue.
On issues where the Supreme Court had ruled in favor. So it's not it's a mainstream position. Unless,
right.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that goes beyond academia, but specifically in academia, the problem is these illiberal mobs that set a rigid orthodoxy and then administrators kowtow to them because that's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease, or because they don't want to be embroiled in controversy, or because of the kind of public choice incentives that all bureaucrats face, whether they're in government or in education. We've seen concomitant to that a bureaucratic bloat in educational institutions, such that a lot of them have more administrators than faculty these days. And a lot of that bloat, a lot of that growth of educational bureaucracy has been in what's best known as DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion offices, which is again an Orwellian name because what these offices do is subvert intellectual diversity, prevent equal opportunity, and exclude dissenting voices. And deans, presidents, department heads, can't stand in their way. So the good news is, I think, unlike kind of some greater social problems, societal issues that we might be facing right now, in academia, I think solutions are fairly clear. It's not just throw up your hands. Kids these days, they're just woke and illiberal and we can't do anything about it. No, in places, in the rare occasions where educational leaders, presidents, deans, department heads, etc., stand up and say, look, we are not in the business of evaluating people's speech and saying this is good, this is bad, or taking a university position and condemning our own, we just don't have time for that. If you don't like it, that's your right, and you can express yourself, and that's great, but we are not going to be involved in those kinds of investigations. And that tends to diffuse those kinds of controversies on those campuses. But there are just all too few educational leaders willing to go that route.
So is that the problem? Is it spineless deans?
In a word, yes. Okay. That's most of the problem.
Who selects those deans, though? Is it the presidents of the university?
Well, it's the nature of the bureaucratic incentives. I mean, ultimately, the faculty votes on the dean, and they're hired through a process, and there's all these different things. The growth of DEI offices prevents things. I mean, look, deans.
And who sets up those offices? I mean, what's the process there? What can be done about that?
Well, universities are pressured by activist groups of alumni, students, and others to, especially in the wake of COVID and George Floyd, because a lot of this is, just the last 3 years has seen a huge growth in these departments, to say that, if you're not doing this, well, look, your peer institutions are clearly more inclusive than you are. You're racist. So that's very hard to counteract, especially when these folks are predisposed to be on the left anyway, and are careerists rather than trying to instill any sorts of principles.
They want their woke credentials to be in good order.
That's right. The virtue signaling.
Well, we've seen this in places outside of academia as well. So, for example, we have a lawsuit here at NCLA against the state bar in Connecticut, and Pennsylvania bar and others have tried to regulate the speech of attorneys on these same sort of dimensions that you're talking about. Where do you think this is all headed?
Well, it depends. You have to take industry by industry and really define your terms. I'm pretty pessimistic about academia. I'm more optimistic about society at large. I think people are waking up, as it were, ironically enough, to the threats that these illiberal currents play. And we have to drill down a little on what we mean about cancel culture, because look, I'm fine. In fact, my profile is probably heightened after all of this. And I'm trying to use this moment and opportunity to shine light on the issue, both in academia and beyond. But there are a lot of people who are caught up in, making donations to politically incorrect groups, and then they get doxxed and fired and boycotted. In Canada, they had their bank accounts frozen.
Yeah.
Those are real issues. I think more and more people are realizing this. And there's pushback even in corporate America. We saw Netflix say that if you really are that offended by Dave Chappelle, then maybe this isn't the place for you to work.
That was actually a positive sign, I thought.
That's what I mean. There are green shoots. Yeah. I mean,
sure.
I don't know. Part of this might be after Governor DeSantis of Florida. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with this, but went after targeted Disney specifically when they opposed certain policies that were misconstrued, I think, in Florida regarding teaching of various things in K-12 education. And he took away their special exemption that they had. I think a lot of corporations nationwide saw that. And very quickly, we had the leak of the Dobbs draft, the abortion case at the Supreme Court very soon after that. And we didn't see corporate America decry the overturning of Roe v. Wade or anything like that. Now, there were some places that said, look, if you need to get an abortion, we'll pay for you to travel or something. But there wasn't, statements against the Supreme Court, against this policy or something like that. And so
not as much free virtue signaling or.
That's right. That's right. I see the pendulum and society at large maybe swinging a little bit back against these excesses. In academia, I just don't know. I mean, we might be past the breaking point. As I said, if Georgetown is actually doing pretty well in having 3.5 out of 150 non-progressive faculty members. Most places the ratio is even worse. Right. So, but that's the faculty. That's before you even get to the bureaucrats, whose incentive, as in government, is to justify their own existence by seeking out dragons to slay. Or in this case, the demand for racism is greater than the supply, so they have to manufacture outrage in various ways.
Or they have to go after less and less significant offenses in order to justify the budget, it seems to me.
As well as these, implicit bias trainings and harassment trainings, as if someone who's, an inveterate bigot is going to see the light after clicking through these nonsensical, HR training materials.
Yeah. Oh my goodness! I should have seen the error of my
ways. I should
ways.
treat everyone equally. Oh, didn't occur to me.
Yeah, no, it does seem like a little bit of kabuki theater. Why? One of the things that I don't understand about some place like Georgetown is why shouldn't students hear? Law students of all people, why shouldn't they have to encounter hostile ideas? Does Georgetown think that their students won't see or hear arguments that they disagree with in practice?
You would think that lawyers, after all, these are law students, are going to encounter far more stressful, challenging situations in their careers than offensive tweets. Or, and the language that's used is that, you're trying to nullify me as a person. If it's a gay student and there's a speaker who argued against Obergefell, say, well, you're trying to, you don't believe I should exist is the language, or you're causing me harm. It's first of all, it's very unpleasant to argue against that. You can say, it's very hard to say, it's one of these, like, when did you stop beating your wife sort of questions.
Sure. Well, it's a logical fallacy, right? It's an ad hominem attack. That's a standard form of logical fallacy. But
this identitarian nature of dialogue is unhealthy. And you even, it wasn't just Georgetown, just March of this year, right? I was under investigation. I had my first ever protest that, and all this time, I don't know if I've been doing something wrong or something right, but in, more than 1,000 public speaking events, I'd never been protested. And here I went to UC Hastings in San Francisco and was completely shut down. Later that same month, I think it was the following week, at Yale, there was an event that was shut down. An event on free speech. Yeah, someone from ADF. So it was someone from the left and the right who agreed on nothing other than the merits of free speech, and that was shut down. The week after that, this didn't make national news because I think University of Michigan dean and PR folks are savvier, I guess, than Yale and Hastings. Jonathan Mitchell, who's the architect of the Texas Heartbeat Bill, SB 8, was speaking there.
Another member of our board of advisors.
I didn't know that. Well, yeah. I went to law school with Johnny Mitch, as we call him. He was...
I'm sure he loves that.
He was... physically, they were like held up signs so like nobody could see his PowerPoint. Another reason why one should never use PowerPoint. I consider it to be unconstitutional, at least in 90% of uses as applied. But in disrupted event, all of that. The only reason...
I could direct you to the next slide. No, I'm sorry.
The only reason I even learned of this was because I was due to speak at Michigan the following week, and the students who invited me talked to me about this, but the deans were very good there. They brought in the student group. They said, we will not tolerate disruptions. You can have signs, you can ask questions, you can exercise your free speech rights. Here's our policy, read it. We are going to enforce that policy. And when I went to speak, first of all, they changed the topic from Supreme Court politics, my book, to free speech on campus. And they brought in Andy Koppelman from Northwestern Law, with whom, again, I agree on pretty much nothing other than free speech on campus. And they did an event on that. The dean of students came out at the beginning, who's a black woman, as it happens at Michigan, and read out, this is our free speech policy. If you disrupt this event, you will be punished, period. Mr. Shapiro, welcome. It was great. That's how it should be done, So anyway, that was just March 2022 at law schools.
Right.
So
after this incident had already happened.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, good. I'm glad someone's doing it right. Glad to hear. Maybe Hillsdale is rubbing off on the University of Michigan or something like that. I don't know. What do you think about Twitter now? I know you mentioned
it's a hellscape
in your That's a pretty good description. You said, not that bad tweets are firing offenses, but it would be good practice for all of us to stop late-night doom scrolling and launching snarky riposts to each latest inanity from our governing classes.
Also, if you've had a few glasses, I recommend not tweeting.
Okay.
There's many scenarios. And in general, a good rule of thumb is don't tweet. Don't
have a Twitter account is another rule.
Sure.
If you want to be...
I'm about to launch a Substack. I think the working title, and pretty much going to be the title, is Shapiro's Gavel. I haven't launched it yet, so if you search it, it just says coming soon. But subscribe to it soon.
So quick and take that name if you are planning to use that one.
Right. I have others if whatever. You're not going to extort money from that URL. The URL anyway is ilyashapiro.substack.com. But Twitter is a key method of promoting Substack, so I can't quite delete my Twitter account and lose my. I think I'm up to 55,000 followers. I had 31,000 when all of this started, by the way.
Okay.
No, it's funny. Somebody mentioned to me, like, was this whole thing planned out? Did you plan out this whole thing just to raise your profile and, change jobs and,
Only people who haven't been through something like this would think that it's not worth it.
Yeah, exactly right. Anyway.
So, will we see snarky ripoffs from you in the future? Because some of us have always enjoyed your snarky ripoffs.
Let me say that
usually
when you go to see me speak live, I'm sure you'll see some. At least I try to have witty ripoffs. Although I think this is bad practice. You should serve the audience wine before the event. This is something I've learned in my public speaking career. The more my audience has had to drink, the wittier I am.
There you go. Okay.
But on Twitter, I don't know. I think, I might have to stick to just self-promotion and try to be clever rather than snarky. I don't know. I still haven't figured out what my relationship with Twitter is or is going to be. I'm sure you'll see, quote-unquote, controversial statements. But that's a work in progress.
Well, and I know, too, you're famous.
You just have to follow me to find out. You never know what's going to come down.
Again was... well, I mean, you're famous for your Supreme Court amicus briefs that either sort of maybe use vulgarity or go through interesting scenarios. They often get attention.
As Bono said in a case that made it to the Supreme Court, they're fucking brilliant.
There you go. He said that about your amicus briefs?
No, he said that about, I forget what it was.
Because that would be a good quote for someone to say about your amicus briefs.
Well, I'm going to, I'll take that. I'll say, Mark Chenoweth said that Bono said about my brief.
And then all you need are ellipses, and it's perfect.
That's exactly right. Well, I built up Cato's amicus program. I'm going to do something similar with Manhattan Institute. Don't yet have the associates, but we'll see where that takes us to. Manhattan, which does great work in a variety of areas, hasn't really had a constitutional commentator. They do on the legal side. They do a lot of criminal justice stuff. Jim Copeland on civil litigation and administrative stuff. But precisely why they were eager. It was a kind of mutual appreciation society, and we got the deal done for me to join them. Was because the constitutional stuff is low hanging fruit and a more national attention, not just New York or urban focused, which is their bread and butter. So
City Journal for those who
excellent publication.
City Journal.
What's funny is that. I'd pitched City Journal various pieces over the years, and it never quite fit or never quite worked out. Now as a condition of hiring me, they asked me to commit to writing for City Journal. I'm like, please throw me in the briar patch,
Right. Well, one thing that you said in your Wall Street Journal piece, too, is that some speech is more protected than others, which, to me, that's shades of Animal Farm, maybe deliberately so. But why is that happening on campus? So I understand why the deans might want to come after people who have viewpoints that they don't like, but why are they allowing these really virulent, hateful kinds of attacks? I mean, again, non-academic attacks to emanate from the faculty on the left. I mean, if they're going to be sort of puritanical about it, why is it? Why are they?
Well, I imagine the administrators wince when they see that. From left-wing professors, the saying that supporters of Brett Kavanaugh should be, killed and castrated, or defending
and fed to swine.
To swine, defending the mob, protesting and trying to intimidate justices outside their homes after the leak.
Or showing up in the middle of the night with a gun and a knife and zip ties and burglary equipment.
Well, the defense of that wasn't so specific, but that's what that sort of thing leads to, of course. Or get this,
I just want to pause on that for just a second. I said this on the podcast earlier this week, but I haven't shared it with this audience, which is Justice Kavanaugh didn't write that opinion that was leaked. Justice Alito wrote the opinion that was leaked. But this guy was outside of Justice Kavanaugh's house. Why is that? Because Justice Kavanaugh is the one that the left-wing media has decided to demonize. At least that's my theory. And so if you're unwell in the head and you don't like what's happening, then your animosity is going to be focused on Justice Kavanaugh. Now, I've said plenty. If you're a fan of the podcast, I've said plenty of things about Justice Kavanaugh that he probably didn't agree with or appreciate. But the idea that someone would turn that into a violent response is obviously completely unacceptable. But the reason it's been focused there, in my opinion, is because of the media negativity. Much of it completely inaccurate, directed toward Justice Kavanaugh.
So anyway, I'm sure the administrators of Georgetown and Georgetown Law did not, appreciate having faculty commenting that way, but they didn't go after it because, it's kind of the French Revolutionary or the pas d'ennemi à gauche, right? No enemies to the left. So even if it's something that makes you wince, you don't agree, but it's
is that Robespierre? I don't know.
I don't. Someone will Google that and we'll get the answer before the end of this recording. I'm sure.
Danton. Any other?
But one other thing I wanted to mention in that vein, one of these tweets was less inflammatory or outrageous or didn't involve death or intimidation, but was attacking Republicans explicitly. And
one of the other Georgetown professors said there are only two political parties in this, or there's
only one political party. The other's a gang of illegitimate, whatever, which isn't as
cultists. I think was in there.
I'm sure that's that's right. But it's not they should be killed and castrated and fed to swine. It's not they should be like the mob should be intimidating justices, but it's arguably illegal because in D.C., where Georgetown is, of course, located, political affiliation is a protected class no less than race and sex. So maybe the University General Counsel might have had a call to that professor. Because that tweet was deleted quietly a few weeks later.
Right. So the tweet we're talking about, this was from law professor Heidi Feldman of Georgetown.
Originally in my resignation letter, by the way, I wrote Heidi Feldblum. So you see that I'm anti-Semitic in that I, have that typo.
Of course, Ilya Shapiro is anti-Semitic. That makes perfect sense, or not, since your family fled the Soviet Union in part because of your family's religion. I take it. So we have only one political party in this country, Professor Feldman said, the Democrats. The other group is a combination of a cult and an insurrection supporting crime syndicate. The only ethically and politically responsible stance to take toward the Republican Party is to consistently point out that it is no longer a legitimate participant in U.S. constitutional democracy. Now, as Ilya points out in his op-ed, Ms. Feldman teaches first-year law students in mandatory courses, not in voluntary seminars that Ilya would have been teaching. And so, as you say, these tweets were quietly deleted, but there was no investigation, there was no disciplinary action. So that just gives you a sense of the sort of tilt that exists. Well, let me ask you, since I do think of you as somebody who's very well versed in sort of things that are happening on Twitter. We have a lawsuit here that we've been pursuing now for the last couple of months.
Yes, I'll retweet your lawsuit. Sure.
Well, I have lots of those requests, but no, this is a little bit different. So I'm sure you saw this, that a couple of months ago, the Surgeon General came out and asked Twitter and Facebook and all these other social media companies to turn over information about their users who had spread COVID misinformation. Maybe you didn't see this because you've been in a firestorm of a controversy of another kind. There
have been so many actions similar to that.
This was even before the DGB stuff came out.
Okay. It rings a vague bell.
Okay. Well, so the gist of the request is that
there's no Mary Poppins video accompanying this.
There is not.
Okay.
There is not. Okay. At least, Janine, have you made a Mary Poppins video? No. Okay. I think that there's the concern that we're articulating on behalf of the clients of NCLA is that they've been deplatformed, that their ability to speak on Twitter, that they've been either been shut down entirely in some cases, or they've been the amount of followers that they have has decreased. Have you experienced any of those sorts of effects?
Well, as I said, my net number of followers has increased. I don't know whether that's, some decreased, but then more added.
You haven't been shadow banned. You haven't.
I have no idea. I could be existing on Twitter in an alternate universe and nobody actually sees me. There's just AI that responds to me in various ways. I've seen examples of that. There's some other word for this. I can't keep up with all the lingo, but there's some AI has been developed on some social media so the person who's been shadow banned or whatever doesn't even realize anything because there's still interaction.
Well, I think in this case,
the thing is, it's so especially rich for the CDC to be doing this. Examples of misinformation. 6 months later, you have to switch sides about what's real information, what's misinformation.
Well, that's right, because some of the quote unquote misinformation is things like the Wuhan virus might have started in a lab in Wuhan, China, or that natural immunity is real. I mean, these are the kinds of misinformation that the government. I mean, misinformation became synonymous with information that is different from what the government happens to be putting out at any given point in time.
You mentioned my funnier satirical briefs. The very first one we did was about 10 years ago or so, and it was challenging a state law in Ohio. I think 12 states had this kind of law that criminalized making false statements about political candidates or initiatives. You're slandering that initiative, right? And how do you determine what is a false statement? There's a board of 5 people, like the Ohio Election Commission or whatever it is, and they take a vote. And there have been 3-2 votes on whether somebody has committed a criminal offense with their false statement.
That doesn't sound like a good way to do it.
Does not. I mean, I'm no fan of misinformation, but the only thing worse than misinformation is giving the government the power to judge what that is.
Well, sure, because on day one they'll say we're at war with Oceania, and on day 2 they'll say we're not at war at Oceania, and those things are supposed to be simultaneously true.
That's how I got to know the late great P.J. O'Rourke. He signed that first satirical brief. Didn't move a comma, I'll have everyone know. So people thought, that's great that you got P.J. to write a brief for you. No, I won't say I had Trevor Burrus and Tommy Berry, excellent lawyers, but. PJ, I've got, we just went to a celebration of his life earlier this month, untimely passing, but was certainly became a friend and was a longtime mentor of mine. And he was great in this Jonathan Swiftian way of exposing government foibles by ridiculing them. And I think NCLA does a decent job of that. You could be a little funnier in your briefs, some of them. But that's especially in the court of public opinion. That's
we're often
really
representing
effective.
Clients, so it's
true. It's true.
Have to rein it in a little bit. Yeah. But so what now? Where do you think things head with Georgetown, with the Constitution Center there? I mean, obviously you're not going to be part of it, but is there room for someone else to come in and take over that role, or what's going to happen, do you think?
Are you looking for a new job? Switching executive director positions?
I'm not.
After appearing on this stage with me, I don't know.
I'm sure my likes would go up if I were on Twitter, but.
Right. So I feel bad for the students. Not because they won't get to benefit from my brilliant teaching. But because
speaking of students benefiting from your brilliant teaching, I'm going to throw it open to the audience here for questions in just a minute. But finish your thought.
Awkward segue, but okay. I mean, they have to keep going to school at this place where it's clearly been indicated that they are not welcome.
Right.
Whatever inclusion they're running, they even having there were lots of obviously news stories written about my thing. They had folks who were like Democrats, those on the center left, that are saying look, I'm sure I disagree with Shapiro on most things on the merits, but what is this? This is not a fire. This doesn't even come arguably close to being a firing offense. This is just, whatever, dumb tweet or tweet, whatever, and that in turn gets those students socially ostracized. Not in theory, but in practice. They've gotten, whatever the student listservs are, or the Slack channels, or however, the young people communicate these days. They've been kicked off of their TikTok or something. It's I guess it's worse than having your bad dance move that's not in sync or something. I don't know. Sorry, it's a Gen Xer trying to make a joke about a Gen Z technology.
Fate's worse than death. Right?
Anyway, on that, see, that is a note on which you throw to the audience. And also on that note, I am out of wine.
Well, we have certainly get our priorities here in order. So, questions for Ilya Shapiro here from our studio audience here is not just our full-time.
You have a studio audience. Do you have a laugh track as well?
I think Ruslan puts that in later, but it's all the laughs are in Russian.
That's in the post-production.
So, yeah, that's it. And all of our summer clerks are here as well. So glad to have our summer clerks. So we can pass this over to you.
Your glass is remarkably still full. I don't know about this wine. This is false advertising. It's like you're billing this as kind of like a raucous happy hour type thing, and then apparently I don't know how other people you've interviewed before me have been, but for you this is just show.
Well, I'm a beer drinker, so that's probably the main reason why.
All right. Well, we have an opening question here, and that is, I'd like to hear more about what you think about the role of the government. We talked about the state of Connecticut and what they're trying to do to control the speech of the lawyers in Connecticut, but at NCLA, we're also fighting against the SEC, the NASDAQ board diversity rule, and we talked a little bit about trying to scare people who are speaking the truth on social media. Does it even go back as far as the Dear Colleague letter from the Obama administration and the Title IX context?
Yes.
Do you think it's all connected and the government is pushing this?
Well, it's connected, not in the sense of that meme from It's Always Sunny where the guy's in front of the board and connecting with the string and stuff. But it is connected in terms of a government.
Bob Dole's healthcare chart. You remember this from Hillary Care back in the 90s? He had this bizarre chart.
I don't remember that. I think I was a freshman in college. I did have those like Dole 20% yellow circles because you're going to cut income tax by 20%. Oh, yeah. I remember that. I don't remember the healthcare chart. It's connected in terms of governing philosophy. That it goes back to Woodrow Wilson. Government as technical experts, we know what's right. We've already figured that out. We don't need any more debate on these issues, and so anyone who's against that is, by definition, has to be exiled, ideologically speaking. That is wrong speak, and we have to, ensure that. So it's connected in that way.
Rob, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So what happened with you is obviously the latest example of kind of the universities turning on free speech and open inquiry and everything you guys have been discussing. So my question is kind of broader, is what to do about the university problem? Is there a way outside of that we can kind of replace it? Because it seems like not only are they failing to perform the function we'd want them to, they're kind of, producing a net harm in some sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if universities aren't going to be bastions of free speech, then who is, right? I mean,
that's more concise. Yeah.
So in terms of producing knowledge, that's why think tanks arose to be the shadow universities. As the founders of FIRE, Harvey Silverglate and Alan Charles Kors, wrote a book called The Shadow University in 1997, detailing these looming illiberal trends and led them to form FIRE. And so we've had think tanks and other institutions be kind of shadow universities. We now have, just this year or last year, the University of Austin as kind of an alternative, creating an alternative institution. We'll see, and there's Hillsdale, there's Grove City College that don't accept federal funding, for example, and they tend to be...
which allows them to escape Title IX, at least.
Yes, and Dear Colleague letters and education regulations and things like that. I don't know. It's going to take a while for the value of, a Princeton or University of Chicago degree to really become devalued. Yale's long been devalued.
I was going to say, I could think of one that's being devalued daily. Although Princeton's not far behind with its.
Princeton was the leading light of the Ivy League on these issues. It's a low bar, but it was. But I think this is another institution that COVID and George Floyd kind of broke. And I did some writing defending Joshua Katz, their storied classics professor who was stripped of tenure on a pretext. But
and you're welcome to come on Wine and Cheese, Professor Katz.
I can put you in touch. We'll make that happen. Okay. He's actually joining the American Enterprise Institute.
Oh well, that's just down the street. So
that's right. You gotta act quick if you wanna pick us up. These folks have been canceled.
This is long form journalism.
Okay. Anyway, did I answer? I began to answer the question. Yeah, I don't have great hope for academia. I mean, honestly, I think it's past the point of no return, if you will. Again, the solution isn't hard. It's administrators standing up and diffusing the situation right at the outset. But few have the courage to do that, and they don't have the incentive to do that.
I think one thing that might happen is that we might get better results from public universities than private universities going forward, because at least the public universities can be held to account by state legislatures. That's not going to happen in blue states necessarily, but red states, you may have some state legislators and legislatures who are willing to step forward and say, look, we're not going to fund you if you're not going to respect free speech, for example, or if you're going to go off the rails in certain ways. To the extent that the legislature controls the purse strings for these public universities, there is some leverage there. I think the private universities, particularly the ones that are extremely well endowed, they're going to continue to get away with stifling intellectual diversity, I'm afraid. I wish that weren't true, but even these universities that
and within universities, the best practices like Robbie George has the James Madison program at Princeton. Most of his funding is separate from the university, so you spin off these 501c3s because there are corporate governance issues with these things, and donors have to be savvy about this.
Hoover Institution at Stanford.
Right. You can't, within your lifetime even, but especially after you're gone, that fund that you established to, hire a, conservative or libertarian professor to teach this kind of class, that's going to be repurposed.
So Anthony Kronman, who was the dean of Yale Law School, wrote a book called The Assault on American Excellence. And he was talking about that this was a really big concern for him, for the students, that the faculty was creating these safe spaces and these safe zones. And what that was doing was a disservice to the students, really, because they weren't able to go, and school should be a place where you debate these ideas. This is the place where you should talk about it. And so for the students who may fall more on the conservative side, so to speak, but it was happening even with students who say that they're, middle left, so to speak, even they were getting attacked. So what do you say to the students who are like, hey, I want an education, and part of that education is being able to debate hard topics. This is what gets you ready for the real world, and the schools are not preparing these students for the real world.
It's a collective action problem. If it's just one student and you're going to get hammered, in part maybe by the professor who doesn't like the answer you gave on the exam, but even more socially and all the rest of it. But if a group bands together and if you can attract national attention, you should be generally okay. But most students don't want to be activists of any sort, left, right, or anything. They just want to go through school. They want to have some fun, for sure, get a degree, get that credential, and go off and get a job at the elite schools. They want to go work for Goldman Sachs, which has its own woke problems and so forth that we alluded to, or McKinsey or go to law school, or go to medical school, business school, whatever the case might be, and that reflects society as a whole. That's why I think every time there's this cancellation effort, and I'm certainly trying to use my moment in the sun, my 15 minutes of fame, I might be on to minute 17 at this point, to wake people up and to get normal people understanding that this is a threat to the American way of life.
One thing I'll say about that, Kristen, when Tony Kronman was the dean of Yale, they didn't have this problem. And so I think it gets us back to having administrators with backbone. And Tony Kronman had a backbone, and he stood up for free speech on campus when he was the dean. And I think, personally speaking, Yale went downhill when they made the decision to pick Peter Salovey as president rather than Tony Kronman, who I don't know if he wanted it or not, but there were rumors that he was among the candidates for that position. I certainly think that the university would have been in better hands if they'd gone with Tony Kronman rather than Salovey.
Speaking of Yale and other lesser schools, I've actually gotten to know through this experience Nick Christakis, who was, he and his wife were subject of cancellation campaign.
Yes, after the Halloween costume incident.
Yeah, we DM now. It's kind of funny. He's not a
Well, they made him a Sterling professor to
Right.
sort of make up for it, which is one of the I think there's 15 university wide. It's very prestigious.
But he's no longer a master, and in fact, they got rid of the word master because, of course, that's
Yes, they did.
that's harmful or something.
It's now head of house, I think, or something silly. But I do think that I think you're right. I mean, students should want to debate tough topics. That is part of what I wouldn't even say law school. I mean, I think it's part of being undergraduate education as well. Should be confronting tough topics and having these conversations.
This whole idea of a safe space, so first of all, yeah, you should be confronting things that ideas you hadn't encountered before, but also, quite literally, I would like safe to mean safe. I mean, of course, universities should be safe. You should not fear physical violence when you go to college or law school or what have you, or fear of a pandemic. Obviously, that's a safety. That's an actual safety issue.
Physical violence.
Right. But good Lord, defining safety as some place that where my feelings don't get hurt. I mean, it doesn't matter that you should go around hurting people's feelings and being a jerk. I mean, no, but.
Well, it used to be sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. But that was what little kids were taught. I mean, we just go around on the recess saying that kind of phrase, and now it's quite the opposite. But I think to your point about safe space, that reminds me of tolerance in the 90s. I mean, everyone was supposed to be tolerance, and then over time it came to be, oh, well, we're only going to tolerate the ideas of the left. We're not going to tolerate the ideas of the right. So tolerance ended up being something that was tilted, and I think safety is sort of the current version of that. So maybe other questions. Have one here.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier, or it was mentioned earlier, that maybe there's some public accountability to be had in public institutions, particularly public universities, because it seems to me there's a trade-off there. Giving the government such influence over what otherwise might be an independent institution is dangerous in its own regard. But if those institutions are not fulfilling their obligations to society as being a bastion of free speech, then maybe there's an obligation to step in there. So what is your happy medium?
I mean, I'd rather there not be a federal. First of all, you asked about states a little bit, but more broadly, I don't think there should be a federal involvement in education. Period. Maybe some funding of hard sciences for various kind of discrete things, but. Most of what the federal government does, and all of certainly the Title IX excesses, borders on unconstitutional, to say the least. In terms of what states should do proactively, I haven't read up on that because this gets into education policy.
Which they do at the Manhattan Institute.
Which exactly.
But they didn't hire you for that.
They did not. Although I will help my colleagues from a constitutional perspective in making those sorts of cases. Mark, I don't know if you've read into this.
Well, I have a couple thoughts on it. I mean, I do think that academic freedom is a real thing, but freedom has to be a two-way street. It can't just be academic freedom for professors of a certain bent and not academic freedom for professors of another bent. And I think it's completely legitimate for the state legislature to step in and say, we're not going to violate your academic freedom, but we're not going to let you violate the academic freedom of this other set of professors either. And if the university is not willing to play by that level playing field set of rules, then I think the legislature is the stewards of the taxpayers' dollars. So the state university doesn't have a right to taxpayers' dollars. The state legislature decides what's done with that money. And I think that in many states, the taxpayers don't want to see their tax dollars spent funding these sorts of institutions that are not willing to stand up for academic freedom, or certainly not willing to have free expression on both sides of the academic debate on different topics. Last question.
Peggy, you're standing between everybody here and their wine. Just want to let you know.
Well, I have a comment first, and that is the phrase "no enemies to the left" comes from the Jacobin French by way of the Russian revolutionary Alexander Kerensky.
There you go.
can use that in
Kerensky,
a
there we
future
go.
talk.
Thank you.
But you had talked about what can students do, and there is a Buckley program at Yale, and I just listened to.
I have the tie.
I just listened to their latest presentation, and Carlos Ear, who is on the faculty there, and a lot.
His memoir about his Cuban childhood is fascinating. I don't remember the name of it, but I
It's
commend that to
Waiting
you.
for Snow in
That's it.
Havana.
That's
and
it.
It won the National Book Award. He's
Waiting for Snow in Havana?
yes,
Okay.
it's a
It's
wonderful
a lovely
book.
title.
Yeah. Completely apart from his politics, it's a great read. But one thing he points out that's really insidious in the humanities is that they hire with job descriptions that now totally lean to the diversity, inclusion, etc. For example, he is an early modernist historian of the Reformation and Renaissance, and he can't get anyone hired in his department because the job listings are the Reformation and race. And so that the job descriptions have totally been taken over, at least in the humanities. Do you see that in law schools as well?
There's definitely ideological discrimination. It's not that we need a professor in torts and race, but what is your scholarship in, and what's your general ideological profile? Forget having served in the Trump administration, but if there's any inkling of connection to the Federalist Society, unless you're 17 heads better than the next candidate, you don't have a shot. That's a separate issue. The bias in hiring. That's a little related, obviously, but different than campus climate, and that does go to the issue of the ratio of different ideologies and among the faculty, because it's the faculty that handles hiring after all. So good conservative and libertarian, very good libertarian and conservative professors can still get hired, but the average one certainly cannot.
Well, let's leave things there. Thank you for joining us on this edition of Wine and Cheese with Ilya Shapiro, and thank you for joining us to help uncork the canceled and decant with the deplatformed. Until next time, thank you for joining us.